Icon Audio Arts.
He was a bright boy. Brian was very bright. Not bright enough not to ruin himself with drugs.
Sam Cutler was born in London in 1943. He is an honours graduate in contemporary history from Cambridge University in 1966. Cutler worked as stage manager and MC with artists like Pink Floyd, Eric Clapton, the Rolling Stones, and Alexis Korner. In 1969, he coordinated and acted as master of ceremonies at the Stones concert in Hyde Park and was featured in the film Stones in the Park. Cutler was also their tour manager during their 1969 tour of America, which culminated in the Ultimate Free concert, where a young black man was stabbed to death in front of the stage. The Stones left for England, leaving Cutler to deal with the messy aftermath. Cutler first uttered the group's famous intro, "Ladies and gentlemen, the greatest rock and roll band in the world, the Rolling Stones." Sam was also responsible for organizing some of the largest shows ever, including the Grateful Dead's 72 European tour and their participation in the Festival Express across Canada. Cutler befriended Jerry Garcia and was hired as the Dead's tour manager, going on to become their co-manager and eventually agent. Through his company out-of-town tours, Cutler coordinated appearances with the Dead, the band, the Allman Brothers, the New Riders of the Purple Sage, the Sons of Champlin, Mike Bloomfield, and Ramblin' Jack Elliott, among many others. A friend for years, I recently spoke to him about the strange circumstances surrounding the death of Brian Jones and the Shady Stones driver, Tom Keylock.
Tom had worked originally as Brian's driver. You know, he had a long relationship with them. One thing about Keylock, which I found weird, Keylock always said that he was in 2nd Para, in the parachute regiment. I never found any evidence of that. I didn't particularly like him. I mean, he was at the Hyde Park show. He was an idiot at that. He kind of had a very patronising attitude to the Stones, used to call them the boys. All that, you know what I mean? I didn't like him at all. He was a kind of relic from a previous era. He just didn't fit in with the 60s at all, or the end of the 60s. Very straight guy, you know? I mean, that's probably why the Stones liked having him around, you know? It was like, in the midst of that chaos, there was him and Ian Stewart as both as kind of, you know, solid, straight, non-drug-taking people.
Why, I wondered, was the slippery Keylock hired as Brian's minder in the first place, especially after being fingered for stealing by his former charge, Keith Richards?
I think the reason that they did that was because they knew Tom, and I think they put it down to a kind of personality clash between Keith and Tom. Keith would buy some furniture. Keylock would go to get the furniture and get some more furniture. He'd take half of it to Keith and the other half he would keep himself. I was there when he was let go by Keith. That was maybe a couple of months, 3 months before Brian's demise. And they were struggling to find someone to look after Brian. And that's when they decided that Keylock would be the person to do that. I think they just decided that on the basis that he'd done it before and Brian trusted him. Yeah, it's like a typical Stalinist trick, isn't it? Brian's become the Trotsky of the Rolling Stones. This is how, this is how the Rolling Stones operate. If they owe you money, the way they deal with that is not by paying their bills, but just by deciding that, it doesn't exist. It's a problem. The way to deal with the problem is to ignore it. And that's a very British way of dealing with things, isn't it,
So how did the now infamous, wildly inept builder Frank Thorogood come into Jones's life, And how might have old Frank viewed the often outrageous, occasionally androgynous, thoroughly dandified, often annoying Brian?
He introduced Thorogood to Brian to do the building work at Crotchford Farm. But there was a time when straight people saw rock and roll stars as just rich fuckwits that deserved everything they got. Working class English people were jealous of them. They didn't like, the fact that Brian, first off, he came, as a kind of middle class boy from Cheltenham and all that. Brian was a terrible snob. Yeah, he was just like a typical Cheltenham grammar school snob.
And what did Sam think about the eventual ousting of Brian Jones by his bandmates from the group he founded and initially drove to the heady heights of international success?
There's also, the situation where in bands where a member of the band becomes so fucked up like that, right? And other people in the band almost feed them drugs or alcohol just to keep them out, out of the loop. I think that Mick and Keith, definitely was sick to death of Brian and wanted to take over the band, no question about it. I mean, the 2 times I saw him, he was completely out of it. But whether that was because of them or himself, I don't know. I saw him once at a party where he was sitting on a sofa with a girl and was very out of it, and people were concerned about him, and they eventually got a car together to take him home. Because he looked like, he wasn't ODing or anything, but he looked very unwell. And the other time I saw him was at the recording studio in Barnes, and what's it called, Olympic. And he was just sitting on the floor. It was kind of like a kid, and trying to get together, changing some strings on a guitar, changing a string on a guitar, and just looked completely out of it. No, the only 2 times I've actually physically saw the man. I listened to lots of conversations about him in the Stones office. My impression was, right, that he was just completely out of the loop. They were sick to death of him. He was deliberately excluded from stuff because he was incapable of doing anything, Geoffrey. There's a massive dynamic goes on in bands, between in terms of the pecking order. And I think in large part he fell victim to that.
How, I asked Sam, did it ultimately go so terribly wrong for the talented but temperamental Brian and the other Stones?
It wasn't just the fact that Brian was the pretty boy and all that. It was the fact that Brian got more money than anybody else in the band. That caused massive resentment. He treated Mick and Keith as kind of, like employees and not as co-equals in the band, So Brian got more money than anyone else in the initial time period.
Cutler was the first person ever to reveal the alleged very close and heretofore undisclosed relationship between Jones and the Queen's often troubled sister, Princess Margaret. He filled me in on the details.
I heard something else about Brian, right, which is very interesting. I was talking to a journalist. He worked for Insight. He reckoned that Brian Singh was tied up with Princess Margaret, that had a house very close to Crotchford Farm, which is why Brian bought Crotchford Farm. Never heard that she was there that night, but I've definitely heard from an impeccable journalist source that Brian and her were friends and that he bought Crotchford Farm in order to be close to her. There's a royal house. There's a house owned by the royal family that Princess Margaret used to use in that neck of the woods. And the person who told me that, he's now dead, was Johnny Bindon, who used to have a scene with Princess Margaret. There's some real stinking bits going on about this, not least, as you say, the sealing of the records. Like, why? Why on earth would they seal the records to do with Brian Jones? Bizarre.
And when at last, in early July of 1969, Brian was found dead in his backyard swimming pool, how did the other Stones and their close-knit inner circle take the news?
I was in the office when the news came through that Brian had died, and I must say everybody was unbelievably shocked. People were devastated. You know, Geoffrey, you can't go through a thing like being in a band for years without some form of affection. Brian was the musical driving force behind the whole thing. Of course, that was somewhat made up for by Mick Taylor being brought on board, which was a very shrewd move on Mick Jagger's part, because Mick Taylor produced, the kind of quality contribution that Brian had been famous for.
Since the very day of his death, right up until today, the Stones and co. have kept exceedingly quiet concerning Brian's death. But why, when he was such an integral part of the Stones from literally day one?
My instinct was that people were just terribly unhappy about the whole thing and wanted it to go away as fast as was humanly possible. No one's ever talked about it. Nobody ever wants to talk about it. I find the whole silence around the thing, very strange. It's almost as if they've been warned.
And when all was said and done, at the end of the day, so many decades later, does Sam feel that Brian was murdered?
Events at Crotchford Farm the morning after, to me, seem absolutely, coterminous with some foul play scenario. Not burning all of Brian's papers, the only possible reason for that could have been to hide what was going on with Brian's money. I think that was the most suspicious thing, and I'm amazed to this day that the police allowed it to happen. He was burning all the receipts to do with buying furniture for Crotchford Farm, and he was burning all the receipts to do with the refurbishing, the building work. So there was no trail of money showing where the money had gone. It was a crime scene. It's unreal. That's looking at it through today's perspective. It's hard to remember how hated Brian was. The establishment hated him.
As to an informal but very thorough investigation into the death of Brian Jones by the band's American manager Alan Klein, here's what Cutler had to say.
No one will admit to it, but I remember being told that that was the case. And knowing Alan as I did, I can't believe that Alan wouldn't have done something like that. But no one, I mean, the only person that's around now is Alan's son. Jody controls ABCO. It's just something I remember.
Brian was a very talented musician and a troubled young man. We all know that his drug problems were legendary, but today he would have probably just checked into a rehab for a few months and been quite okay. That he should have been kicked out of his own band and then murdered is inexcusable. I don't point the finger at the Rolling Stones, but at Tom Keylock and his crew. So many years later, Brian and the band that he created are celebrated and remembered. There's no doubt that Brian was a bad boy. For me, that's one of the main reasons I still love him. I'm Geoffrey Giuliano.
Geoffrey Giuliano is the author of some 30 internationally best-selling books on the Beatles, John Lennon, and other iconic musicians of the 1960s. In 2006, his book, Paint It Black, The Murder of Brian Jones, was made into a film by Stephen Woolley and Nick Powell entitled Stoned, The Wild and Wicked World of Brian Jones. It remains a cult classic and the only film bio of the Rolling Stones. Giuliano is also a veteran journalist, having written for dozens of high-profile newspapers and magazines, including The Sunday People, The Daily Mail, The News of the World, The Mail on Sunday, Playgirl, and Rolling Stone. A noted film actor, Giuliano starred in such movies as Vikingdom, Scorpion King 3, Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, The Fifth Execution, Far Cry 3, Fire Desire, among many. In addition, he hosted the long-running North American syndicated radio series, Geoffrey Giuliano's Roots of Rock, for 5 years, as well as pioneering the audiobook industry in the 1990s by authoring, narrating, and producing over 250 original, non-book-based, interview-driven productions. Giuliano's publishers included Random House, HarperCollins, Delta Entertainment, Durkin Hayes, Playaway Audio, Speechworks, and B&B Audio, among dozens more internationally. In 1998, Random House acquired his firm Tribute Audio, for which Giuliano acted as CEO and publisher for 5 years. His best-selling audiobook, That Fateful Night, True Stories of Titanic Survivors in Their Own Words, was nominated for a Grammy. In 2014, Geoffrey Giuliano founded Icon Editions and G2 Media Arts to market his updated works as well as publish new projects. As a visual artist, Geoffrey has been showing in galleries across America since 1977, garnering impressive reviews. His first professional assignment was designing several T-shirts for The Who's Pete Townsend in 1976. Geoffrey also designed and illustrated many of his original rock biographies for the biggest publishers in the world from 1984 to 2006, as well as designing for his pioneering record label, Samba Records, in the mid-1990s. From 2006 to 2011, Geoffrey was also the primary designer for the French fashion house Cotai. When Giuliano first conceived of creating his own literary imprint, Icon Editions, he became responsible for illustrating and designing 35 book covers, several hundred CDs, DVDs, as well as dozens of promotional posters, and eventually an entire collection of exclusive fashion and art. The expansive Design by Giuliano brand grew out of Geoffrey's impressive commitment to the arts and is the culmination of a lifetime's work by an extraordinarily talented and determined Renaissance man.
Icon Audio Arts. Thank you for listening.